Hey guys, welcome to another Memory Monday. Today we're going to go to a story I would say many of you, if not most of you, will be unfamiliar with. But hopefully, as we go through this during the week, you're going to discover some amazing treasures. So join with us. So before we get into our story too much today, I just want to give you a tiny bit of background because our story is about King David. But it's before he was king. He'd been anointed by Samuel, but still at this point, Saul is just chasing him and making his life miserable. And God had given him a tight relationship with Saul's son, Jonathan, who, I mean, if you think about it, if it weren't for David, Jonathan would have been king. And so it's just an interesting dynamic how God put these two godly men together as more than friends, almost like brothers. And so I'm going to read the story through one time, and please forgive me, I'm going to be looking past you all towards the screen. Our printer is not working, and I need the big letters because it's not quite as light in here as what I would do if I was studying at home. But and David stayed in strongholds in the wilderness and remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver David into Saul's hand. So David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a forest. Then Jonathan, Saul's son, got up and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. And Jonathan said to David, "Don't fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You're going to be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that." So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. And David stayed in the woods, and Jonathan went to his own house. Now, that was in the New King James Version, which is a version I really love. But there's also the Christian Standard Bible, which I usually will take those two and look at them and kind of compare and put together a story that may be a little bit more conversational, while still, as always, maintaining accuracy to the Word of God. So let me, and again, this is not the way exactly I would do it at home. I would read it, I would turn off my computer screen, try to tell as much as I can, but that's a little boring to watch. But as also as I'm going through, like David then stayed in the wilderness strongholds, and so I'm picturing him in these places that gave some form of protection, and because I've been to Israel and even before that I looked at some books about Israel, I saw that there's a lot of mountains in this area that he's at, a lot of rocks, huge boulders. And so as I'm seeing him staying in these wilderness strongholds, I'm picturing him in this like desert place, but in a valley with rocks all around, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. Now again, this is one of those things I have to kind of, before I went to Israel, and it's weird because I had looked at pictures forever of Israel, right? And yet, when I would see the word wilderness, I would see what I grew up with in wilderness in Kentucky, of seeing trees and rolling hills all over the place. And so the wilderness of Ziph, instead, I'm letting myself see basically what I see in California when I go out to Hemet. And so David's staying in the wilderness strongholds in the wilderness of Ziph. And there's a strange word, right? Ziph. And so that's a word I want to practice. And in particular in this story, there's the wilderness of Ziph is repeated several times. So I really want to get that right. And Saul searched for him every day. And so I'm picturing Saul, at this point, he's probably sending soldiers out, right? But still, I'm picturing him looking behind the rocks and around the cacti and those kind of things. But God did not hand David over to him. And so I'm picturing God like, no. David was in the wilderness of Ziph in Horesh when he realized that Saul had come out to take his life. Like, wait a minute, he's out to kill me. Then Saul's son Jonathan came to David in Horesh, again, a repeated word, and encouraged him in his faith in God, saying, don't be afraid, for my father Saul will never lay a hand on you. So, I'm picturing, as he's coming, I just picture David kind of sitting on one of these rocks with his head on his arm, because he says he encouraged him. And he said, don't be afraid. So if he's telling him, if he's encouraging, putting courage in him and telling him, don't be afraid, what's David dealing with? With fear, right? With discouragement. And so I picture David, as I'm learning the story, I'm picturing David just kind of like, man. And Jonathan says, you yourself are going to be king over Israel. I'm going to be your second in command. Even my father Saul knows that this is true. Man, what a guy, right? I'm picturing Jonathan like, what's this guy got to be like, right? And then the two of them made a covenant. So I would find a way to picture that covenant and probably joining they made a covenant in the Lord's presence. And so I'm in the Lord's presence. Afterward, David remained in Horesh, and Jonathan went home. And so, I picture David, but at this point, I'm picturing David. Jonathan he's encouraged him. He's told him not to be afraid. And so I picture David, a whole different countenance, right? And Jonathan went back home, where Saul was. And so I would love to hear from you. What are some of the things you would do as you're learning this story to help lock it into your head so you'd be accurate? What are some of the words you would change? Maybe there's a version that you would prefer over this. And again, if you speak more than one language, being able to look at this story in more than one language will really give you a leg up on being able to remember the story and to remember it in a more conversational way. And again, I'm at another one of those thresholds. So if you have not subscribed to the channel, it would be great. It could put me over the big 70 mark, right? Like I'm an amazing internet influencer now. Right? Sure. Yeah. The fact that any of you ever watch this always amazes me. But I appreciate your prayers. And until the next time, keep on telling those Bible stories.